Morning, everybody, and welcome. We're glad that you are here. It's good to see people here from Georgia. It's good to see people here from Kansas. I have not caught if we've got people here from other places as well, but you're welcome to. Welcome to this Better Brains for Babies webinar. And I am going to turn it right over to my friend Bradford Wiles. It is great to have you here, Bradford. He is at K-State, Kansas State University, and he's going to talk about building resilience in rural low-income families and communities and the Hidden Talents Framework. So Bradford, I'd say take it away. If you have questions for Bradford that you want to put in your in the chat, I will kind of feed them to him at appropriate moments throughout the session. We will hopefully also have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end.
Great, thank you so much, Diane, and welcome to you all. I saw we had some people from Texas as well, so welcome. And there's my topic, and as I get started, I always put my acknowledgements at the front, because if I wait till the end, I rush through them. So I just want to make sure that I acknowledge and thank Diane for her support, Shanisha Nickerson at the Georgia Training Institute as well, partners in the Better Brains for Babies work. And then a lot of this, the findings on rural families come from the USDA NC 1171 Rural Families Speak About Resilience multi-state research project, and the Speak About Health and Speak projects before that. And then, of course, I'd like to acknowledge my university for supporting the work that I do, and I'm really glad to be here. So, who am I? I'm an associate professor and extension specialist. I'm sort of Diane's analog at Kansas State. I am fortunate enough to be a master trainer. I did my undergraduate degree in Indiana, go Hoosiers. I did my graduate degrees at Virginia Tech, go Hokies. And most of my work has been on focusing on rural families, particularly in the context of access to quality, affordable childcare. And I've also done some work in access and use of the healthcare system. And so I'll give you a quick overview of my talk today. First, I'm going to start with a personal statement, and then I'm going to give a little bit of a landscape of what's going on that we see in rural families and some of the risks and some of the protective factors that are part of rurality and what rurality means. Then I'll talk a little bit about, so that's more at the broad view. Then I'll talk about the Hidden Talents Framework and that in relation to risk and resilience in families, in particular rural families who are facing somewhat different risks. And then we'll talk, because we're in Better Brains for Babies, we'll talk a little bit about brain development and what that means and some of the interesting findings from the Hidden Talents work. And then we'll try to, my favorite thing about talks like this is making sure that I include the so what, so what does it all mean? And with that, I'll get started. We're going to speak about resilience. So, one of the things I want to explain is that COVID has been hard on me personally. And I say this to make sure that everyone understands that, we're all experiencing this pandemic right now. We all have different challenges, and we have those sort of typical life challenges as well, right? So my father-in-law died, but then an atypical challenge was trying to remote school my daughter. My daughter had her cleft palate surgery, and that was something that we were expecting. But again, not pandemic related, but in the context of it, just a little bit more difficult. And then I'm an extrovert. For those of you out there who are also extroverts, I just want to acknowledge you and say that I know that this part has been very, very hard. We thrive on social interaction. That's how we charge our batteries, and it's difficult for us. And then, of course, we have this ambiguous loss of all the things that we're missing, or all the milestones, all the family gatherings, those things that have been affected. And so what I ask is just your compassion, your grace, and I want to also extend that to you all as well, and recognize that you're all working in these conditions, and that building resilience is not something that we do outside of ourselves. It's also something we want to do internally and in our own families. And so I just want to really get that out so that you understand that oftentimes when I'm talking about these things, we think that they're for other people, but they're also for ourselves. So I think I've covered that. I want to talk about the landscape of risk and resilience for rural families. And you know, there are different definitions of rurality. I have two maps here, and you can see that on the top map, what is defined as rural is a huge swath of the United States. All of the green there is described as rural, and then below that is from the kidsdata.org, and they define rurality a little bit different. So for example, the Census Bureau estimates that about 19 to 20% of families, and these data are from before the pandemic, so we're not quite sure where they are at this point, but it's been about 20%. But then the National Survey of Early Care and Education, which is the lower map, estimates about 10%. And so, you know, regardless of which metric you use, there's a significant proportion of, you know, 10 to 20% of rural communities that live in poverty. But one thing I need to emphasize that all the way through this talk is that rurality is not a monolith. There's diversity within rurality, just like there's diversity within urban communities, within suburban communities. There are different political affiliation, there are different socioeconomic statuses, there are different countries of origin, and certainly different cultures in terms of families of origin. And you know, to make that point, that you know, when we think about diversity, oftentimes we'll look at people of color and race, right? And I think we have this notion, at least in different parts of the country, that rural means white, and that's not exactly right. It's varied in population, in terms of age, race, education, all of those things, and you can see from this figure that 1 is highly urban and 9 is highly suburban. I'm sorry, rural. And as you go across, right, there's still essentially the same sorts of representativeness across. In fact, really only in the suburbs do you see this upper level. But as you come down to the more rural, it's still a distribution of people of color. So I really want to point that out, that it's not just all white people in the country in some bucolic view of rurality. I also want to point out too that Black, Native American, non-white, Latinx people, as well as immigrants, LGBTQ+, and disabled people are all part of the diversity of rural families. So I will try to talk in generalities about what we know about rural families, but I also want you to understand that we know that each community in each location has unique characteristics. And so we'll work on addressing some of those things that you can identify at your local level and work from. So one of the big barriers to resilience in rural communities is the healthcare system, and one of the key issues there is rural residents are just more likely to be uninsured, and then as a consequence of that, they don't typically engage in preventative care, and so. Part of that ability to access those resources in the healthcare system is tied to their poverty and their family's resources. And then one of the things that we see across the board is that those in racial and ethnic minorities will have greater health disparities, and importantly, rural racial and ethnic minorities have even greater health disparities than their urban peers. And part of that is the rurality context, right? That it is more difficult to access healthcare systems because of transportation needs, because of the disappearance of rural health clinics and rural hospitals. And then finally, that element of needing a specialist. So for many rural communities, it's a single office that has a generalist. But if there's a need for a specialist like a cardiologist or a neurologist or anything like that, they'll need to go somewhere else. And of course, that takes resources and time. And if you have young children, you need to get care, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, there's a whole lot of elements that go into rural health and rural health care. So we know that rural communities have the highest rates of premature death. And what I mean by that is not infant mortality per se, but premature death, meaning people aren't living as long as they are expected to live. And over time, urban communities have shown improvement on premature death, so essentially life expectancy, but they're getting worse in rural communities. And so we need to acknowledge that health factors into so much of what we know about rural communities, and you know, really your health is instrumental in everything that you do. Any of us that have ever had health challenges, that whether they're acute, like you sprained your knee and had to walk on crutches, or chronic, we know that those things can dramatically interfere in how things, in the outcomes that we have as a consequence. So, you know, you can't work, you can't, you know, engage in other protective factors for you and your family. About 20% of the rural counties increase premature death rates. That's not good, right? Urban communities are going the opposite way. And then flatly, rurality has the lowest health outcomes overall in terms of a predictive community. That's versus suburban and urban. And then of course, layering on top of that, racial and ethnic minorities, that gets you to the lowest health outcomes of all. And why is that? And we've done a lot of research on this. And most of it points to rural poverty. And I want to point out here, and this is based on some work in that NC 1171 project, the Rural Families Speak About Health and Resilience. My colleagues did some work on economic security, and what they came to is that economic security is much more than just a paycheck, right? The paycheck is instrumental, but it's so much more. When we think about economic security, it's housing security, it's food security, it's healthcare security, it's childcare security. You know, any of us that have had to manage childcare among different providers, particularly with our families, trying to shuffle kids from one to the other, and if something happens for one, trying to move, you know, that takes a ton of calculus and a ton of effort to try to you know, provide care for children, to say nothing of early care and education and how important that is. So in rural communities, you know, food, another output of the Rural Family Speak Project is there's been a lot of work on food insecurity, and food insecurity in rural communities is quite pervasive, and it's the low income families that are the most food insecure and the most vulnerable. And so they're you know, really struggling with that. And when you're thinking about these risk factors, you know, childcare. So for families with young children, it's an issue, right? Without childcare, it's very hard to go to work to provide for your family. In rural communities, they have the biggest barriers to finding care. In particular, licensed childcare, and those of us in the field tend to really recognize the benefits of licensed childcare in regards to the cognitive, social, emotional, and physical development benefits for children. It's really kind of the difference between watching children and teaching children, right? Those are two very different things. I like to use the analogy of reading a book, right? It's one thing to read a book to a child. It's another thing entirely to read a book with a child. And what we find with in early care and education facilities, particularly licensed facilities, we find that they take the reading with approach, right? That the children are the main focus, that they're working on building their skills and in very intentional ways. And don't get me wrong, play is the work of early childhood. We know that. It's more that licensed centers tend to be more proactive in providing play opportunities that can lead to skill building, particularly with peers. But one of the interesting things about rural communities that is very different in this context, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why, is that there's a different preference for care in rural communities. For many of them, they place a high value on family care. And so and it doesn't have to be a parent, but there's, a real cultural connection to family care by grandparents, or there's also, I want to say, a lot of pressure on mothers to stay home with their children and raise their children. And we know that, we understand that, but that it comes up against those previous slides about poverty and income and being able to get economic security. And those, there's always an opportunity cost to not be in the workforce when you're raising children. And it's not simply that you're missing out on your paycheck. It's also you're missing out on the job experience. You're missing out on a record. So if you're trying to demonstrate that you are a reliable worker, but you have a 4-year gap, that's very hard, or a 5 or even longer year gap. So for women, there's a real feminist element to rural poverty and rural childcare. And again, thinking about those resources and that economic security, rural families travel further for childcare, twice as far as their urban counterparts. And what's really truly interesting, I think, as we think about rural childcare, is that for decades there's been this concern that rural childcare is somehow inferior to urban childcare, and that's simply not the case. That in all of I won't say all, in the vast majority of available studies, there's no real discernible difference between the quality of care of licensed childcare across urban, suburban, and rural contexts. And so, that's a protective factor, right? That's something that is really important to keep in mind, is that there are opportunities for quality care, except that there are only, there are 60% of rural communities who just simply don't have access to licensed care. But if there is a licensed care, it's high quality. So that's a plus. And then what are some of the resilience factors, right? We've talked about these risks, and they are substantial. But there are some resilience, some protective factors that go into rural communities and what they are about. And so for many, many rural communities, they will rate their communities higher on safety than their urban counterparts. And typically that is the case. Typically rural communities are safer, particularly against violent crime. But we also know that drug use in rural communities has tracked pretty well with urban communities over time. It is now lower than that of urban communities, but for quite some time with meth and the opioid crisis, rural communities were suffering more. They've been able to kind of essentially bend the rural curve down, but the urban curve has gone up. And so one of the really cool elements of looking at risk and resilience in rural communities is that rural communities have this sense that a single individual can make a big difference, and so that's very different in a perspective between urban communities and suburban communities and rural communities. We know that rural communities are pretty. Everyone pretty much knows each other, and if you don't know the individual, you know someone who knows that individual, right? So your degrees of separation are lower, and as a consequence, rural families, and in particular rural stakeholders, feel more empowered to make change because they know that they can make a difference just as an individual. Again, this isn't universal, but these are some of the things that have emerged from the research literature. And so, interestingly, while there are significant risks for rurality, most people in rural communities will have a very positive view of the quality of life. Again, even though their life expectancy is reduced, the rates of premature death are higher, there tends to be a view of living in rural communities as a positive for quality of life and for well-being. So it's hard to rectify these two perspectives, right? Like on the one hand, we have all these risk factors. On the other hand, we have these protective factors that are really important, and in particular, social support, and this positive view of the quality of life. Most people in rural communities have indicated that they have at least a few people to rely on. And we know the benefits of social support, and in particular, the intersection of formal and informal supports. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. So moving on to sort of the frameworks for how we look at rural resilience and in particular, the child development angles. We know that typically we take very deficit-based approaches to child development, and this has been a critique for a while. But as we're starting to look further and further, we're seeing more and more evidence that a strengths-based approach could serve us all a little bit better. So, one of the big monumental elements to come out over the last decade are the adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. And I'm sure that many of you have done some reading on ACEs, had webinars on ACEs. And so I won't, delve into that. That's a whole talk in and of itself. But essentially, these are experiences as a child that really include abuse, neglect, or real harsh family dynamics, like incarceration or divorce, and so we know that those create neural pathways that are responding to the fears, the insults, and the unpredictability of those environments, right? So when I talk and when I give our Better Brains for Babies trainer sessions, one of the things that I really emphasize is that all of us enjoy predictability, right? To some extent. That's not to say some people aren't more comfortable with change than others, but nobody wants to walk into a place, or let's say walk into your home, and you're not going to know from one day to the next who's going to be in your house, right? That's unsettling. And as you're growing and trying to, for children in particular, trying to learn about predictability, trying to understand your world, trying to learn things that adults already know, those unstable or unpredictable environments can be very difficult. And then the other element of those unpredictable environments is that they often are very harsh as well. So the issues that are leading to abuse and neglect and dissolution and incarceration are then manifesting themselves in the way that the children are being treated in those homes. You know, essentially our brains respond to these harsh environments by predicting danger, and or at least attempting to predict danger and protecting ourselves from it, right? A lot of what I will talk about coming forward is an evolutionary biological approach to understanding why our brains are wired the way they are. And for a very long time, we've talked a lot about mitigating risk or ameliorating the deficits, right? And that's important. That is critical work. I don't want to undermine that. We want to help children, we want to help families, and we need to do our very best to mitigate the risks they face. But as a consequence of that, we know so much more about the vulnerabilities of adversity exposed people and children than we do about any potential strengths that come out of that. Now, I want to be clear, no, you know, ACEs are not good. Experiencing ACEs are not good. There's nothing good about child abuse, child neglect, incarceration, dissolution of family relationships, you know, witnessing physical conflicts within the home. There's nothing good about that. But our brains will do the best they can with what they have. And so, you know, that to me is one of the critical parts of understanding how we get to this hidden talents framework, is recognizing that we are evolutionary beings, right? We learn from our environments, and our brains are trying to create neural pathways that will serve us well. So we're trying to adapt, right? We're trying to adapt to our worlds. And we have an orientation towards protecting ourselves and our safety, and really focusing on what we can control. And so one of the main theories is this life history theory, and it's that we adapt to environmental stressors. And one of the elements that's really critical there is that we think of some of these adaptations as maladaptive, and yet we know that in some environments they could be completely adaptive. So, you know, for example, we know that people with high ACE scores prefer smaller and immediate rewards over larger future rewards. So, you know, you could take $10 now, or you could take $20 next year. Well, that's 100% return on investment, and that's pretty good. But we know that people with high ACE scores will typically take the $10, and we'll talk about why that might be. It's you know, obviously seen as dysfunctional to do that, but as we'll see, it may actually be adaptive. And we know that that adults living in poverty also have a better ability on the social emotional side to express empathy and to be empathic with their family and friends. And so, you know, that adversity that they're facing does lead to empathy, and that empathy again is adaptive. And so, so let's talk a little bit about the assumptions of the hidden talents framework. The key here is that our adaptations are designed to maximize the fit between what we're experiencing externally and how we process information internally. That further, there are specific forms of adversity that may shape mental abilities in different ways. And this is really critical too. For me, when the ACEs framework started coming out, one of the things that was really troubling for me is that they essentially all ACEs were treated equally. And that's not to say that a cumulative ACE score isn't useful, but I think this work and others is not, I think, this work and others is starting to recognize that there are differential effects based on the type of ACE that a child experienced. And so, and again, thinking about it from a biological or life history, it was the life history theory, apologies, that people can perform well in contexts that match where they were trained, right? I mean, we do this all the time. There are all sorts of experiments at the college, in the college classroom about, having people sit in one spot for the most of the semester, and then you take them to a different one and test them, and they're just not going to do as well, right? And that's just a little tiny example of essentially what we see in all of human development, is that we're best when we are in our comfort zones, even if our comfort zones are really harsh and unpredictable, right? Some unpredictable environments can produce some skills. And so to get at what I'm trying to convey is that here's your classic deficit model, right? Adversity impairs all abilities. I mean, it's just, that's it, nothing. But an adaptation model says that, okay, adversity impairs safe adapted abilities. It shapes and can impair safe adapted abilities, or it can enhance stress adapted abilities. And it definitely enhances stress adapted abilities, right? And so it's a very different frame to say, okay, all adversity impairs all abilities, versus there is a chance that there can be adaptation that is beneficial. It's hard to really think about what those might be until you start to get into the nitty-gritty of hidden talents and harshness and unpredictability. And for harshness for environmental stress, so when we think about stressors and ACEs and where they come from, it's really a question of harshness. So we measure that by looking at the rates of morbidity and mortality in our age ranges in the local environment. And so you can see sort of the outcomes, and in particular health outcomes that come along with the harsh environment. But then we also see unpredictability. So, those are all the things that we know are critical, right? The people in and out of the house, all the things that I talked about, right? All of these stressors that occur. I mean, for any of us who have just moved, that is a stressful thing. And for low-income families, it again really contributes to that unpredictability. So moving from apartment to apartment to apartment, that often results in changing school systems, changing family networks, or I'm sorry, social networks, and it creates a real unpredictable environment. And getting back to what we know through the Better Brains for Babies work and from neurological work, that unpredictability is such a risk factor. But and part of that that unpredictability leads to devaluing future opportunities, right? Because it's so unpredictable that why would you ever count on something happening in the future when it's first, so many times what you expect to happen hasn't happened, and you need resources now, not in the future, not tomorrow, not a month or a year from now. You need them now, right? And so we should be able to understand that taking thinking about the $10 versus $20, that's adaptive, right? That's something that for those families, and particularly for those children, gives them some security in the moment, even though for us as researchers and as you know, if you're middle class or upper class, you see that, you know, that they could benefit in the long term, but essentially they don't bank on the long term. There's no, you know, there's no reason to. They've been their brains have been very well trained to not expect anything in the long term, right? So why would we expect that anyone would be interested in the long term if all of their childhood they've essentially not had that expectation, right? That they might have when they were very young, but you know, it doesn't pan out. And so so what happens then, right? And then we're going to get into some of the neurobiological elements, and so I'm going to talk about executive function. And for those who don't know, executive function is really kind of the management center of your brain, right? Like it's not a physical place, but it's how the brain allocates resources to different tasks, right? It's the CEO. And you know, it typically goes along with working memory. So there's executive function and working memory. Executive function is really kind of the management of how you're responding or presenting yourself. And it really makes up two major domains, right? There's inhibition and then there's switching, task switching. So inhibition is typically our ability to not do things. So you know, you see in early childhood with some of the frustration tasks, you'll the frustration task is always like one of the cruelest things to me, well, except for the attachment work where they scare kids with spiders, but I'll leave that away. But the frustration task is children are given like a box with keys, but none of the keys open it. And you know, inhibiting the ability to keep trying keys, even if you know they don't work, is an example. Ability to inhibit an impulse, right? So the marshmallow, the M&M studies are a classic example. Researchers put M&Ms in front of a kid, says, hey, if you don't eat those now, I'll give you twice as many when I come back, and they leave the room. And many of the kids will just say, you know, I'm going to eat these 5. And again, it's that same element of $10 or $20, right? That for children from unpredictable environments, inhibition is you know, useless to them. They need those M&Ms now, because even though that researcher promised that they're going to bring 10 instead of 5, doesn't matter. They're happy to get the 5 because there's no guarantee of that, right? And that orientation is something that as practitioners, we're really going to need to think about and try to address, right? And recognize that this is an important element of people's development. And right now, we haven't been able to see anything in the hidden talents framework to understand about that inhibitory control, what we can do to enhance that. So, you know, we do need to take a risk mitigation approach to that at this point, because we don't yet know what hidden talents might exist. But for task switching, we do know that there are benefits even beyond those of high SES and low ACEs individuals, right? But one of the things that's critical is that these skills really only emerge when environments are also unpredictable. So essentially, the environment has to be unpredictable enough for these skills to emerge. If you take just a very predictable environment, these skills aren't going to show up. They're not going to. The task switching skills are actually less. They are lower than their peers who have not experienced adverse childhood experiences, as well as in particular impoverished families as well. And so, you know, what needs to happen there is there needs to be some element of unpredictability in the task for them to maximize their task switching. And why is this, right? So, so inhibition is costly in unpredictable environments, right? Opportunities are short-term and they're fleeting. You don't know where they are. and long-term opportunities are less likely to pay off, right? We are creatures of habit, and when the habit is our investments or our long-term thinking doesn't pay off, what do? We adapt and say, hey, nuts to that. We're never gonna get that payoff, so we might as well get what we can and get it right now. And getting back to the risk factors that I talked about earlier, like if you're hungry now, and you can get a cheeseburger for $1.99, that at that moment, that's much more rewarding than the promise of being able to go to the grocery store and get a healthy meal and bring it home, which you don't know could happen, but that cheeseburger's right there in front of you, right? And so for people from harsh environments, they're going to get their nutrition where they can. They don't know often where their next meal is going to come from. So when it's there, they're going to eat it, and it's adaptive for them. It's really important for us to and one of the reasons I really wanted to talk about this is to recognize that while we might think that that is just a terrible decision, it's not for them. It's adaptive. Now, it's up to us to create environments where the $2 burger is a choice with a $2 healthy meal that can provide benefits that are also as useful. And so, that's getting to those policy systems and environments work, which is really critical as we think about addressing the risks and the hidden talents. But one of the benefits of harsh, unpredictable environments, and I say that knowing that there are a lot of deficits, but because it's unpredictable, children who grow up in harsh and unpredictable environments are much better at focusing attention in different places. They can switch between tasks very, very easily because they've been conditioned to do so, right? They have one environment that changes, they do another that changes, they go to another that changes. They have one thing they're supposed to be doing, but then that's changed. They go to one school and they're in math at this level, and then they go to another and they're at math at another level. And so there's all these environmental stimuli that are really building these neurological pathways that focus on adapting to unpredictable environments. And most importantly, not only can the students from harsh environments identify new patterns more rapidly than their peers, but they're more accurate than their peers in recognizing the pattern. So it's not just speed, it's that they're more accurate. And that is impressive. That is a hidden talent. We would expect that, and indeed they do, these children would perform lower than their peers on task switching. But the key for this work is that they added an element of uncertainty to the tasks, and as a consequence, they got to see this hidden talent emerge, right? And so we're still working on how to make that happen in classrooms, in childcare, in our career opportunities. But providing that element of uncertainty can really help build skills and leverage those strengths for these vulnerable kids and these vulnerable adults. So, I want to, get that the take-home message here on harsh environments is that they can produce adequate or even enhanced problem-solving skills under the right conditions. This is adaptive intelligence, right? If you're familiar with the multiple intelligences work, this is one of the most important ones. Is that there's a lot of pressure to adapt, and so children will build these skills within their neurological networks to access them, right? We talk about this all the time in Better Burns for Babies, that these pathways start kind of as dirt roads and then become oil and chips and then become paved and then become a double lane and then a 4-lane and then finally a divided highway and an interstate, depending on how much traffic
I know
there
she
is.
tried my man in that courthouse.
So the more traffic that we have, the more conditioned and the more pervasive these pathways become, the more used they are. So what we want to try to do is leverage these hidden talents into educational, career, and intervention opportunities. We're still early on in this work to be able, and I say we, the field is very early on in identifying them, but there's really good reason to believe that there are other hidden talents that go along with that. I have a colleague at Oregon State who's a graduate student who's on the 1171 Rural Families Speak About Resilience project, and she uses the term hustle a lot because what we see is that people in poverty will hustle. They're very good at adapting to their environments, and they work very, very hard to do that. They hustle. They are very strategic. Again, the strategies might not be adaptive from the outside world, but internally they make a whole lot of sense. And so one of the critical factors here is to understand that there's a timing element of these as well. And so one of the things that that the field's trying to tease out about these benefits is, whether current adversity and early adversity are the same thing. So we know that that early adversity can create these enhanced abilities, particularly in task switching, in the executive function. They can at least just get the same performance as peers, or the same performance as you would expect, but then they could also be impaired. But then current adversity also affects these. And so there's some interesting emerging work about understanding the differential effects of early childhood adversity and current adversity, and the cumulative effect of that, or the differential effect. So it's pretty cool. It's something that it provides an opportunity for us to investigate what those are, and then as we get further, we'll be able to implement those in multiple different settings, and in particular in early care and education settings, to help practitioners identify and provide scaffolding for those hidden talents in ways that can be very beneficial for students. But there are some limitations to this work, right? We still haven't been able to tease out the differential effects between neglect and abuse. We also need to figure out how we compare performance. So how do we compare performance with same age peers, with other people with ACEs, with different SESs. So we're trying to really determine what their performance, establishing how that performance looks in the real world. So for example, I'm going to read this for you. We have two individuals, Anne A and Sue S. So Anne is from an adverse environment. Her danger detection could be consistent with a hidden talent, right? They compete in a math and danger detection test. So they're doing math and then they're trying to find out, to look for dangers. Her detection performance could be consistent, Anne's adverse, with a hidden talent in 3 ways. She could outperform Sue. She could perform better at danger detection relative to her math performance, or both. But there can be some crossover. So if she could outperform Sue, or can outperform Sue on danger detection, and it's closer to her math performance, that's great. But even if Sue's performance is objectively higher, so the person who came from a safe environment is higher on both tasks. So the math task and the danger detection task, we still would have missed the opportunity to look at Anne's performance if we hadn't done these things together, right? And so typically scientists look at one thing at a time, and we need to really incorporate these different tasks in our research so that we're able to tease out these phenomena that occur at the neurocognitive level, and without incorporating them together, again, linking those really harsh, unpredictable environments and recognizing that that is what helps hidden talents emerge is crucial. So some of the things that I'm really wanted to take home here is that not all ACEs are created equal. Threats are different than neglect, and they result in different neurological pathways. So a particular study, several studies I looked at children exposed to threats have different cognitive brain structures, right? They have reduced amygdala, medial prefrontal cortex, and hippocampal volume. So threats are really reducing the ability to process the inhibitions to threats. But for neglect, we see a different effect, which is that there's reduced volume and function in the frontoparietal regions, and those don't exist in threats. So again, there are profound consequences for how our brains are wired as a result of these two things. And of course, the combination can lead to both of these things. But if it's one or the other, which is not uncommon, that's a huge element. So what? So recommendations for the future. We can, what we want to do is acknowledge and internalize that there could be hidden talents in the children in your orbit. We want to promote adaptive behaviors for children to build that self-efficacy. So as things emerge from the hidden talents framework, and as we're able to translate the research into practice, we want to create environments that have enough unpredictability for these kids, but also are not so chaotic that they essentially result in another unpredictable environment that is detrimental. So there's a sweet spot there. But another element is understanding and explaining to stakeholders that when you see these what we would typically call maladaptive processes, to understand and recognize that these processes for these individuals can very much be adaptive and should be viewed as such. They've been very, very well trained to take what they can at the time. And we need to, as a society and particularly those caring for young children, to understand that while we might think that that's a bad decision, there are really good reasons for that, and we need to acknowledge those. Even if we want to try to intervene on those, we need to recognize the why of why that happened. I'd really like you to think about hidden talents and amplify that. People from adverse backgrounds, people with high ACE scores, very much could have hidden talents, and we need to recognize that our brains are really good at skill building, even in the context of very harsh environments. There's always, I wouldn't say always, but typically there's some benefit that goes along with all of the deficits that come along. So we need to identify that and amplify it. Really, I can't emphasize this enough, but the strengths-based approach, that can help so many policy systems and environments, stakeholders understanding that it's not just doom and gloom, that there is an opportunity here. And then finally, I just wanted to remind you that the rurality has both risk and protective factors, that for those of you working in rural communities, internalize that a single individual can make a big difference. I mean, that's why we're all here. We're trying to make a difference in the lives of children and families. You can be that person, and you can spread that word to others and help them be that person. So incorporating that into the identity of rurality. We know that rural families typically have a strong informal support network, but providing formal support can go a long way. And then framing that rural safety element as a part of protecting vulnerable families and including them in the one of us element, the one of us view of rurality as a safe environment, and helping those who have safe environments recognize that those without them in their communities are part of their community and can be helped and can help them reach out and build their networks and provide that support that they so badly need. And then finally, recognize that all of these elements of healthcare, childcare, poverty are inextricably linked. I mean, they're all together in policy systems and environments, but that doesn't mean that you can't make a difference in those. It just means that as you go, you'll start to recognize these policy systems and environments that are taking these deficit-based approaches, and you can be the champion for a strength-based approach and can really reference hidden talents as a great starting place to say, hey, it's not all bad. These kids can do things that are better than we can do. And so with that, I would say thank you. I know we're bumping up against the hour, but got time for a few questions if you'd like. And I just want to say thank you. Any comments, any shout outs, questions, whatever you'd like. That's my son, Hunter, my wife, Danielle, and my daughter, Hannah.
Thank you, Bradford. That is a huge amount of information, but lots of really great ideas and insights, and we really appreciate it. What questions do people have? I see, thanks so much, so very many aha moments. Do you have something specific that you want to ask, Bradford?
Say again?
I'm asking, does anybody have something specific that they want to ask you? Some thanks.
Yeah, don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
Yeah. All right.
Information that you're going to be able to take and use in your role and in your position. You have people have a lot of different kinds of roles, those that are on this webinar, but hopefully he's given you some pieces of information that you can take back and use. If you still, we do have a question. How do you teach adaptability to very young children?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So when in a childcare setting, you can teach adaptability through providing opportunities for them to adapt, right? So you can get them involved in an activity and then introduce something that, so let's say you have block building, right? You're sitting there building blocks. And I won't say you, the child is sitting there building blocks. And you want to teach them to be adaptable. So maybe you take a few of the blocks away and say, hey, these blocks you can't play with. Now they're going to get upset. Don't get me wrong. But their ability to adapt will be predicated on their reaction to that, right? And we know that for high ACE score kids, that inhibition is going to be a problem, right? So, when you see that, no problem, give them the blocks back, right? But what you can do is instead distract and say, okay, hey, you're building those blocks, let's do this, right? And then you play with cars, and then let's do this. And that's how you teach that adaptability, if you bring them with you as opposed to just removing, right? The one is testing that inhibition, the other is teaching that adaptability, that ability to switch tasks very rapidly. So that's how I would approach that. You can just imagine the difference between those two, right? One, you're taking blocks from a kid and they're just going to freak out, of course. But the other is being really intentional about helping them learn to switch tasks.
I love that concept of intentionality. That's really, really important as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely, man. Yeah. Great. Yeah. Thank you, Rhonda.
I don't see any
and-
other questions, Bradford. I'm going to stop the recording quickly.